So hello, I'm Andrew Vine from the Insight Bureau, and today we're recording Café Insights with Adit Jain. Adit is Chairman and Editorial Director of IMA India, and here we are at the Oasis Cafe today at the Grand Hyatt Singapore. Adit, welcome.
Thank you.
So Adit, you and I actually go back many, many years, and I remember you chairing government roundtables when we were at The Economist. I was at The Economist, and we were bringing foreign investors into India, and India seemed to be so full of promise and great potential. But somehow, like kind of 15 years later, we still seem to be talking about India in those terms, promise and potential. However, we've obviously recently seen growth rates moving up, gone are the days of the modest 5-6%, and we're kind of getting used to like 8-9% growth. So has India finally made it, do you think?
I think it has. Yes, I do remember the old days when we talked about India having a promising future. But I think in the wake of the global financial crisis, and rather abruptly, that future is already here. For several reasons. I think the most important amongst them is the fact that India will grow in the decade ahead at about 9 to 9.5% per year because of certain fundamental structural changes in the economy.
But you think so over the next 10 years, that's more like a permanent shift, not just kind of a temporary...
No, it is a structural shift, and for the following reasons. I think the most important reason is that India's savings rate is now 36 to 38%, right? And with an incremental capital output ratio, that's basically jargon for efficiency in the economy, with an incremental capital output ratio of 4. You divide 36 by 4, and it's an empirical formula, and you get 9. So I believe, therefore, that the average growth rate going forward will be in the region of 9%. And you know something, Andrew? You would have noticed this as well. If you looked at other Asian economies, you saw a physical transformation take place in their infrastructure. So you saw better roads, better ports, better airports, nicer hotels. And that happened when their savings rate actually exceeded 30%. And that's happening in India, albeit at a slow, wobbly pace. But now you see, nicer airports. In fact, very nice airports, motorways, expressways, very bad traffic. But that bad traffic is because Indians are indisciplined. But the infrastructure is actually coming up. So the first driver, in fact, to growth will be a higher savings rate and a more efficient economy. I think the second driver is going to be the effective privatization of the economy. Now, I was looking at some sums which suggested that in the year 2000, the private sector's share of GDP, in terms of total revenue, private sector companies, was 40%, right? And state enterprise was 60%. And 10 years down the road, private sector share of total revenues is 68 to 70%. Right? So we did a little plot, very rough plot, back of the envelope, 10 years forward. And what we've noticed is that the economy is effectively being privatized because the private sector is growing faster. And what that actually means, you have more efficiency. Greater efficiency will drive growth.
And I wonder, there's a joke that goes around in India that India really only grows at night because that's when the government's asleep. Is this performance of the kind of efficiency we're seeing, is it as a result of good governance over the last decade? I somehow suspect it is.
No, it isn't. You're quite right. I think India will grow at 9% despite the best efforts of our politicians. I think governance has only fallen. But there is a silver lining to this cloud, and that stems from the rise of civil society, where for the first time politicians are actually going to jail. Senior bureaucrats are going to jail for crimes that they have committed, and I think that is very important. The most important legislation which is being debated is the Lokpal Bill, which is basically the appointment of an ombudsman to examine corruption. And if that bill is passed, even the Prime Minister can be charged whilst he is in office without any permission and have to serve time.
Do you think that the reforms which have been underway, in fact, when the government roundtable we were talking about with Manmohan Singh as finance minister 15 years ago, now he's prime minister, these reforms, it's still a long way to go still.
Yeah, I think they're plodding on, but I think the pace of reforms has narrowed, rather slowed, and a lot of it is moved from the federal government to the states. I mean, there are 2 or 3 important reform initiatives that the federal government need to undertake. The first one I mentioned about passing this anti-corruption bill. The second one is actually on its way, which nobody has even mentioned or discussed openly, and that is very surprising. And that will be an important game changer, and that is UID. The word UID stands for Unique Identification Number. What this will do is that the UID Authority of India is chaired by Nandan Nilekani, who used to be chairman of Infosys. The idea is to give every Indian a unique, PIN number, a smart card, which will essentially ensure that government services that are delivered to people, for example, subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, food subsidies, education vouchers, can all be delivered more efficiently. Currently, the efficiency rate of government delivery is no more than 20%. I cannot claim that this will reach 100%, but even if it were to double, then suddenly you will find a more productive India. And that is the second reform. The third reform that's pending is the goods and services tax. If this was to go through, it would add, to my mind, 3% additional revenue, 3% of GDP additional revenue per year. And I did some sums which suggested that over a 10-year period, that would amount to $1 trillion extra in the treasury coffers which they would not have received. So I think there are 3 or 4, important legislations which are pending. If they happened, I'd be quite happy.
I mean, we have Asia to thank for dragging the world economy out of recession. But I wonder whether really it's more China's story than India's. I mean, but what kind of what kind of significance do you see of India driving growth in the world and its place in the world economy?
Well, I think currently it remains a China story. But if you were a multinational executive running a large business, you would look at India 10 years henceforth.
Right.
And I think in 2020, 50% of global growth will come out of India and China. And I think China will contribute 30% of global growth and India will contribute 20%.
Interesting. I mean, there's certainly, no end of comparisons between China and India. I mean, very, very different systems and countries. But clearly, that's where a lot of multinationals will be placing more and more of their attention. I mean, if you talk about 9.5%, it's not really sure that China can sustain that.
Probably not, because of their demographic dividend will turn unfavorable.
Which, of course, I mean, the projections for India's population keep rising for many more years to come.
Well, we will have a younger population at least for the next 25 years.
Right.
I think, you see, the other important point is you talked about global growth and market opportunities. In 2020, India will be a $5.5 trillion economy. So big companies like GE and Samsung and LG will have to, place their bets here.
Yes, sure.
As they are doing.
Well, that kind of moves me into, talking about how business attitudes may be changing or shifting. I mean, when I think of you, Adit, I think you're one of the most comprehensively well-placed people to advise companies, because you're engaging with government one minute and other politicians, with economists and think tanks in the country and the Indian business population community. And of course, throughout the year you're bringing foreign subsidiary CEOs and CFOs together. So I kind of really want to ask you what your impressions are and how you think global companies are really changing their attitude or perception towards India.
In very serious ways.
Yeah.
The most tangible way is that the chap running the India business now reports directly into somebody in America or in Europe. So the concept of India being about a way back, reporting into Singapore is dying.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of our clients, we have 1,400, and a lot of them who are running India actually run a number of other countries. So that shows the rise in the pecking order. One important example is GE. GE has moved away from a silo vertical product structure into a country structure. So the guy running India actually has P&L responsibility, right? and because they want to be a $20 billion business in a few years. A lot of the larger companies are already $10 billion plus in India, so it is in fact a very large market. So if you were to cast China aside in the equation, you would find that non-Japan Asia, apart from China, India is the only one which can provide such a large market opportunity. So they're looking at it very differently, big investments, and the way they're running it now is different.
I mean, do you think you could swing too far in the opposite direction? Do you think there are companies that will get overexcited about India and actually be, have misunderstandings or misperceptions about what the real reality of the opportunities are?
Yeah, I suspect there'll be a few of those too.
What do you see as, what are the kind of misunderstandings or the areas of ignorance perhaps by multinational people taking a look at India perhaps for the first time?
I think they might overjudge the ease of tapping into the India opportunity. I think the opportunity is very large, but clearly the biggest challenge and the biggest competition doesn't stem from other multinational companies. Their challenge actually stems from taking on Indian companies,
right,
who are run perhaps more efficiently, better cost structures. They are able to attract people because people have growth opportunities. So a few of them will go wrong, no question.
Now, I mean, on that point, I mean, India has a reputation for not really getting its act together, especially in terms of, like you say, the infrastructure to get business working. It's been quite an ongoing discussion about just how slow India's been to get both the hard and the soft infrastructure in place to be effective. I mean, talking about obviously roads and rail and airports perhaps are being fixed, but even soft infrastructure, in terms of getting education.
Yeah. I think you're quite right, Andrew. I think eventually we'll be able to fix the hard infrastructure. It will take a lot longer than it did in other countries by virtue of the fact that we are fundamentally inefficient. I think it will be a lot harder to fix the soft infrastructure. The biggest challenge these days for most managers is to find people. You can't find people.
It's kind of ironic in a country of 1.2 billion people.
That's true, and that's absolutely right. It is quite funny. But I think the way to do this is to fix education, and the way to do that is to go through the modification in the universities bill, etc., which will allow private universities to be set up and produce competent, educated people who can actually spell and read and write. But you are quite right, that will be a longer challenge and a slower process, and until we get to grips with it, the struggle will continue. Our costs are going up like hell. Can you imagine salaries rising the average at 12 to 15% a year with a currency that's appreciating 2 or 3% a year?
But I must say that this is a common story that you hear across Asia. It's the same in China, that China's not necessarily such a cheap place necessarily to get things done or to have teams of people developing your business or your technology or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think China's problems are different, but they're there. I think China's cost structures are rising, and I think some of it is with intent. The government wants domestic consumption to rise as the economy rebalances from export to domestic consumption. And I think coupled with that, the renminbi will also rise by about 15% over 3 years. So China will have its problems too. But they can handle them better, I think, than we can.
Well, I must say, sitting here in Singapore, and we deal with international business people all the time, what we're hearing is general enthusiasm for India. And the impression that I get is that India has kind of reached its tipping point now, and that, further progress on a number of fronts is kind of gaining momentum, so that India has kind of broken away from its past. How would you kind of sum that up?
You see, the thing is, yes, I think you're right, but I'm sure that there is a high probability that India will get stuck as a middle-income country. A middle-income country, mediocrity, where you'll go thus far and no further, so you could increase our per capita income to $8,000, $10,000 a year and get stuck there. It's not going to become a first world country in the next 50 years. Now, why could that happen? For several reasons. I think one of them is lack of governance, the evolution of oligarchies, the sinister conspiracy between politicians and business and government. A lot of these things. So unless we are able to fix that, we might just find that we've gone thus far and no further.
Yeah. But it's all looking very encouraging. Thank you very much indeed, Adit, for your analysis, your observations. Always good to see you.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.